Chicago, 2015. A city of endless lights, frozen winds, and shadows that never quite went away. On the south and west sides, where the neon glow didn't reach, children had begun to vanish. At first it was one, then another. They slipped away between the cracks of a city too busy to notice. From playgrounds, alleys, and corner stores, their names flickered across local news tickers for a day or two before fading into the static of the next headline. Police reports filed, parents interviewed, promises made, and then silence. Officially, they were runaways. Unofficially, they were forgotten. For 6 years, the pattern continued, quiet, steady, and merciless. But somewhere in the bureaucratic fog of the Chicago Police Department, one man refused to let it go. His name was Detective Franklin Dorsey. Retired, disgraced, haunted.
Frank used to be good at his job, too good. 30 years in the Violent Crimes Division had left him carved hollow, a man built out of case files and late-night coffee. He'd seen everything a human being wasn't meant to see, the aftermaths, the confessions, the kind of evil that didn't need horns or fangs, just indifference. And yet, none of it compared to the silence that followed the disappearance of his niece. Her name was Abigail, 10 years old, vanished on her way home from school a decade ago. The case was ruled a runaway. No evidence of abduction, no witnesses, no ransom note. Just absence. Frank never believed it. And maybe that disbelief was what broke him in the end. He drank too much. He argued with his superiors. He crossed lines, legal, moral, personal. And when the department finally pushed him out, he didn't fight it. He just took the ghosts with him.
But ghosts have a way of calling you back. It started small, an article in a community newsletter, a familiar face in an old case file, the same school district, the same stretch of street, the same vanishing act. Frank didn't want to believe it at first. He told himself it was coincidence, a trick of memory, of grief, of obsession. But late at night, when the city quieted and the wind howled down the empty streets, he could feel it. Something was wrong, something big, and no one else seemed to care. So, he started digging. He didn't have access to official databases anymore, but he had something better, old favors and older instincts. He began collecting names, dates, addresses, pinning them to a corkboard in his small apartment on the north side. Within weeks, the board was full. Photos of smiling children, faded missing person flyers, maps marked with red string connecting neighborhoods most people had forgotten existed. What he saw terrified him. The disappearances weren't random. They formed a pattern, one that curved around industrial zones, under highway overpasses, through the city's neglected arteries.
It's about time.
He was looking at something organized, systematic, invisible.
Frank took the files to his old precinct. They humored him at first, offered him coffee, polite smiles, pitying nods. Then they told him what he already knew they'd say. Frank, you're seeing ghosts again. Maybe he was, but ghosts were real enough to him. So he kept going. Late nights turned into dawns. The wall of his apartment became a labyrinth of faces, each one a silent accusation. He followed paper trails that led nowhere, interviewed families too tired to hope, and dug through garbage bins behind precincts looking for misplaced reports. And then, one night, he found something. A report filed by a rookie officer 6 years earlier, never followed up on. A young boy, 10 years old, vanished outside a closed-down textile factory. The factory had been abandoned for years, but the kid's last known location matched the center of his map almost exactly. He stared at it for a long time. Then he grabbed his coat, his flashlight, and his revolver, an old habit, one he'd never quite broken.
The factory loomed at the edge of the city like a monument to decay. Windows shattered, steel beams corroded, graffiti etched over forgotten names. The air smelled of rust and rain. Inside, everything was silent, the kind of silence that hums in your bones. Frank's flashlight cut across dusty corridors, catching scraps of paper, a child's shoe,
Hello, is
a
anyone
rusted
there?
tricycle frame. He crouched,
About time.
picked up the shoe, turned it over in his hand. The size matched the boy's file. Then he heard it, a faint metallic clatter from deep within the factory. He froze, listened. There it was again, not echoing, not random, rhythmic, like something alive. He followed the sound down a narrow corridor that opened into a vast loading bay. At the far end stood a door, chained shut from the outside. Fresh padlock, fresh marks. Someone had been here, recently. Frank raised his flashlight, heart pounding. The beam landed on a wall covered with old posters, missing children. The same faces he'd seen in his files. Hundreds of them, plastered over one another like a shrine. And then, the realization hit him. This wasn't just a dumping ground. It was a message. Someone wanted the disappearances to stay buried, literally and figuratively. Frank staggered back, the air thick and cold. He didn't know what scared him more, the idea that he'd finally found something, or the thought that someone else already knew he was looking. He heard the clatter again, closer now. He turned, flashlight trembling, and for a fraction of a second, he thought he saw movement, a shadow slipping between the pillars. "Hello?" His voice cracked. Silence answered. He stood there for a long time, every instinct screaming to run. Finally, he did. He turned and walked out into the freezing rain, his breath visible, his hands shaking. When he got home, he locked the door, shut the blinds, and sat staring at his board. There were more connections now, more dots to link. The network was bigger than he'd imagined, spanning neighborhoods, city lines, even state borders. And if he was right, if what he saw was real, then this wasn't the work of one predator. It was a system, a machine built on the disappearance of the innocent. Frank Dorsey didn't sleep that night. He sat at his desk, a half-empty bottle of whiskey sweating beside him, the rain ticking against the window like a clock counting down to something inevitable. The wall before him glowed in dim yellow light. Hundreds of photographs, red strings, notes, and maps layered over one another until they resembled a mind unraveling on paper. To anyone else, it looked like obsession. To Frank, it was order.
a story the city refused to tell. He had spent 30 years reading the chaos of human cruelty. He knew how to separate coincidence from intent, noise from signal. And the signal here was deafening. The missing children weren't spread evenly. They formed clusters, tight, deliberate circles, each one orbiting an area of the city that had one thing in common: abandoned infrastructure. Old factories, shipping yards, storm tunnels, warehouses, all sitting on properties owned by a patchwork of shell companies, names that meant nothing until you looked closer. Frank leaned forward, squinting at one company name: Northbridge Logistics. It appeared again and again on deeds, invoices, and maintenance contracts. It was a ghost corporation, filed in Delaware, with no employees and no online presence. But its address traced back to a small office on the outskirts of Chicago's industrial belt, a place no one had reason to visit. He felt that old familiar pulse in his chest, the one he used to get right before breaking a case open. But this time, it wasn't excitement. He decided to pay the address a visit. Not as a detective. He didn't have that badge anymore, but as a man with nothing left to lose. The morning sky was steel gray when he arrived. The office was a squat concrete building sandwiched between a scrapyard and a power substation. The windows were tinted black, the sign out front faded to illegibility. Inside, it smelled of dust and disuse, but the power was still on. A low hum vibrated through the floor. Servers, maybe, or machines below. He walked the hall slowly, every footstep echoing back at him. In one corner office, he found filing cabinets, locked. He pried one open with a screwdriver from his coat pocket. Inside were shipping manifests, old payroll logs, and something stranger: surveillance photos. Children, families, streets he recognized from his map. He froze. His breath hitched. This wasn't a coincidence. This was collection. And then he noticed the security camera in the corner of the room, its red light blinking. Someone was watching him. He left fast, didn't look back. But as he drove home, his pulse still racing, a white van slipped into his rearview mirror. It stayed there for several blocks. He took a left, so did the van. He turned right, so did the van. By the time he reached the freeway, his mouth had gone dry. At the next exit, he pulled into a crowded gas station and parked between two trucks. When he looked again, the van was gone. He waited 5 minutes, then 10. Nothing. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that he'd crossed a line, and now something was aware of him. That night, he went over the files again, forcing himself to focus. There were patterns within patterns, clusters that repeated every few years, always within a specific radius of those abandoned properties, always after city budget cuts or shifts in neighborhood patrol routes. Whoever was behind it knew how the system worked, how to hide inside its blind spots. Frank pulled out an old precinct contact, Detective Maria Alvarez, one of the few who still answered his calls. She'd been a rookie when he left the force. Now she worked missing persons. He met her at a diner off the Dan Ryan Expressway. The smell of burnt coffee and fried eggs clung to the air like smoke. She slid into the booth across from him, skeptical from the start.
Frank, I heard you've been digging around again. You trying to get yourself arrested? You still think those disappearances are runaways? We don't have resources to chase every cold lead. You know how it is. Yeah, I do. That's the problem. He showed her the photos, the maps, the property links. She looked, frowned, and finally whispered, Jesus, these addresses, they're all owned by subsidiaries tied to old city contracts. Waste management, freight, maintenance. Half these names haven't been active in years. Frank leaned closer. Someone's using them as cover, Maria. There's a pattern. You just have to see it. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. All right, I'll run a few of these through internal records, quietly. That word, quietly, hung in the air like smoke.
2 days later, Frank got a call from an unlisted number. You need to stop asking questions. The voice was calm, male, almost bored. Who is this? Frank demanded. Doesn't matter. You start stirring ghosts, you'll end up one of them. Click. Silence. He stared at the phone for a long time. Then he picked up the receiver again and called Maria. No answer. He called twice more. Still nothing. That night, as he sat in his car outside her apartment, he saw 2 unmarked SUVs parked down the block. Their engines idled. No lights. No movement. Just waiting. He didn't go inside. He drove away instead, every nerve in his body screaming. The city he once protected had turned on him. Or maybe it had always been like this. He just hadn't seen it clearly until now.
The next week was a blur. He moved his notes to a storage unit, bought a burner phone, and started recording everything. Voice notes, dates, times, observations. If something happened to him, someone would find it. And then, one morning, a package appeared at his door. No return address. Inside was a single USB drive. He plugged it in cautiously. Dozens of image files appeared, grainy surveillance photos. Children, the same ones from his board. But these were recent, within weeks. There were timestamps, GPS coordinates, and at the bottom, one photo that made his stomach twist. A child holding a school ID badge from Abigail's old school. He slammed the laptop shut, his chest tight. It wasn't just happening again. It had never stopped. He called Maria again. Still no answer. So he went to her precinct, asked around. They told him she was on leave. Family emergency. No details. But as he turned to leave, he caught one officer watching him too long, hand hovering near his radio. Frank left through the back door. He drove to the coordinates from the USB. They led to a stretch of industrial land near the river, fenced off with warning signs, city property, no trespassing. Beyond the fence, he saw concrete structures half swallowed by weeds. It looked abandoned, but faintly from somewhere within, he heard the low thrum of machinery. He stood there, gripping the fence, trying to decide whether to climb it, when a black SUV rolled up behind him. No sirens, no lights, just idling. He turned slowly. 2 men in dark coats stepped out. No badges, no words, just stares that told him everything he needed to know. They wanted him gone. He nodded, raised his hands slightly, and backed away. They didn't follow. They didn't need to. The message was clear.
That night, Frank sat alone again. Rain streaked down the window, turning the city lights into rivers of gold and blood. He whispered to himself,
They're still out there, and they're watching. He didn't know who they were yet, but he knew one thing. Whatever network he'd stumbled upon wasn't just criminal, it was institutional. The kind that didn't break laws, it rewrote them. He reached for his recorder, clicked it on, and spoke into the static. October 18th. I've confirmed at least 22 disappearances, linked by property records and corporate ties. Whoever's behind this has access. Data, surveillance, manpower. This isn't random abduction. It's logistics. Someone's moving people through the city like cargo, and the city's letting them. He stopped the recording. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "If anyone finds this, don't look for me. Look for the children." Frank Dorsey hadn't left his apartment for 3 days. The blinds were closed, the coffee cold, the air thick with the smell of dust and anxiety. The board on the wall had grown larger, more photos, more strings, more questions that refused to die. Every time he looked at the faces of the missing children, something inside him tightened. He could almost hear them, echoes of laughter, fragments of life, frozen in those photographs. He'd been through hundreds of cases in his life, but this one had teeth. It gnawed at the edges of his sanity, whispering that he was too late again, that, like before, he would fail them all. And then, on the 4th night, the phone rang. Not his burner, his landline, the one no one was supposed to have. He picked it up slowly. "Frank Dorsey? Who's this?" "You're the one looking for the kids." The voice was trembling, young, female, hesitant. There was traffic noise behind her, a city bus exhaling air, a distant siren. "Who are you?" Frank asked. "Someone who saw something a long time ago. I can't talk here. Meet me." The line went dead before he could reply. A few seconds later, a text buzzed on his burner phone. A location. A time. Tonight, 11:30 p.m.
It was an old bus station downtown, the kind that never really closed, just waited for its own extinction. Half the benches were broken, the vending machines long empty. Frank sat in the far corner, hood up, hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. He watched every face that entered, every shadow that passed under the flickering lights. At 11:38, she appeared. She couldn't have been more than 25, but life had carved years deeper into her. Pale, sharp features, eyes that flinched at every sound. She wore a gray hoodie, her hands buried deep in the pockets. She sat down 2 benches away, not looking directly at him. "You came alone?" she asked softly. "Yeah," Frank said. "You?" "There's no one left to come with." A pause. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence. "What's your name?" "Doesn't matter. You can call me Aaron." Aaron told him she'd lived in one of the neighborhoods on his map, the South Side cluster, near the old textile factory. Back then, she was just a teenager trying to survive. She'd seen kids go missing before, but no one ever talked about it. Everyone said it was gangs, or drugs, or bad parenting, but it wasn't, she whispered. Then what was it?
People. People with badges, with trucks. They'd come late at night, unmarked vans, no sirens, no lights. They'd take kids, the quiet ones, the ones no one would miss. Frank's grip on the coffee cup tightened until it cracked. You saw them? Once. I shouldn't have. I was running away that night. I hid under a bridge by the freight yard. There were men loading something into a truck, boxes like cargo, but one of the boxes moved. It shook. She paused, swallowing hard. And then one of them saw me. I ran. I never went back. Frank leaned forward. Can you show me where? She nodded. Not tonight. Too risky. Tomorrow morning. There's a church nearby, St. Gabriel's. Meet me there. I'll take you.
But Frank's instincts, the ones honed by 3 decades of surviving the city's underbelly, whispered something else. Nothing about this felt safe. When he got home that night, he double-locked the door and checked the street twice before drawing the curtains. Sleep never came. He kept replaying her words, people with badges. He thought of the SUVs, the phone call, the surveillance camera blinking red in that empty building. Whatever this network was, it reached deeper than he'd imagined. And if Erin was telling the truth, she might already be in danger, or worse, bait. Still, by morning, he'd made up his mind. The next day was overcast, the kind of gray sky that pressed low on the city like a weight. Frank parked a block from St. Gabriel's Church, a decaying Gothic structure squeezed between 2 new apartment buildings. The front door was open. The air inside smelled of candle wax and dust. He waited in the back pew, scanning the few parishioners scattered among the rows. 11 a.m., 11:15, 11:30. No Erin. He walked outside, checked the street. Nothing. Then he noticed a folded piece of paper wedged under his windshield wiper. He opened it. 1 sentence. Don't trust anyone. They're watching the church. No signature. No mark. Just that. Frank looked up and saw a black sedan idling at the corner. 2 men inside. He recognized one of them. He'd seen him at Maria's precinct. He drove away fast, taking back streets and alleys, switching lanes at random until the sedan was gone. His pulse hammered in his ears. Back in his apartment, he tore open a new notebook and started writing down everything Erin had said. The bridge, the trucks, the boxes. He cross-referenced her story with old shipping records, city blueprints, and his own case files. And there it was again, Northbridge Logistics. The same company, the same pattern. He dug deeper into corporate archives, property tax records, and campaign donations. That's when he found it. The company was connected to a city development initiative from 8 years ago, funded by both public money and private donors. One of those donors was a name he hadn't heard in years. Councilman Richard Hale. A clean politician, a family man, and one of the officers who'd signed off on his suspension a decade ago.
Frank leaned back, exhaling slowly. It was all connected. The kids, the shell companies, the city contracts. Someone had built an entire operation under the guise of urban renewal, using forgotten spaces to hide something the city didn't want to see. He didn't know what the end game was yet. Trafficking, experimentation, or something even darker. But he knew where the trail led next. The freight yard.
That night, he parked his car 3 blocks away and approached on foot. The yard stretched for miles, a maze of containers,
rusted rail tracks, and shadows that swallowed the light. He found the bridge Aaron had mentioned. Concrete cracked, graffiti fading, a relic of the city's industrial age. Below it, freight cars sat silent, their sides marked with the North Bridge logo. Frank crouched behind a pillar, scanning the area. A single floodlight illuminated a small office trailer near the center of the yard. Two men stood outside, smoking. He raised his camera, snapped a few shots, faces, plates, logos. Then, just as he lowered it, he saw movement in one of the containers, a flicker of light, then darkness again. He was about to move closer when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "You shouldn't be here, detective." The voice was calm, familiar, and terrifying in its certainty. "Who is this?" "You've been digging in graves best left closed." "I'm not looking for graves," Frank said quietly. "I'm looking for children. Children grow up. Some disappear. Some are taken. And some are given away." The line went dead. Frank stared into the dark yard, the weight of that last sentence sinking in. He slipped his phone into his pocket and started backing away. That's when he noticed the men outside the trailer were gone. The floodlight was still burning, but the air had changed. He wasn't alone anymore. He made it back to his car, heart pounding, lungs tight, every instinct screaming that the city itself was turning against him. He didn't go home that night. He drove aimlessly until dawn, stopping only when the sky began to pale. When he finally pulled over at an overlook by Lake Michigan, he sat in silence, watching the water move like mercury. He whispered into his recorder, voice low and unsteady. "There's a witness. She knows more than she said. They're tracking her. And now they're tracking me. But this isn't random. It's systemic. They have power, resources, protection. If I disappear, someone has to keep digging." He stopped, stared at the horizon. The lake stretched endlessly ahead, the sun rising weakly over it, pale, distant, uncaring. For the first time, I think I know what happened to Abigail. The morning after the freight yard stakeout, Chicago seemed quieter. Too quiet. Frank sat in his car outside a diner on 43rd Street, nursing a cup of stale coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The city around him moved on as if nothing had happened. Buses came and went, kids hurried to school, sirens echoed in the distance. Life kept moving. Only his world had stopped. He had been here before, on the edge of a truth no one wanted to hear. But this time, the truth was listening back. He spent the next 2 days buried in records, digital archives, city development grants, abandoned property permits. Every line, every signature led back to the same cluster of shell corporations: Northbridge Logistics, Urban Renewal Trust, Halo Systems, all under different names but sharing the same tax IDs and funding sources.
And buried deep in the paperwork, he found it, Project Safe Haven. The proposal dated back 12 years, a joint venture between private contractors and city agencies. Its stated purpose? To provide temporary shelter and rehabilitation for at-risk youth in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods. On paper, it looked like charity. In reality, it was a ghost network. No physical addresses, no operating staff, and no children ever officially discharged. Every child entered the system. None ever left.
Frank printed the files and spread them across his table. Each paper was a piece of a puzzle he was afraid to finish. He called Maria, his old colleague, the only person he still trusted. "You're not going to believe what I found," he said quietly. "Frank, I've been trying to reach you for days. Where are you?" "Listen to me. Project Safe Haven. It's not what they said it was. The city's involved. Hale's involved." "Frank, they used those kids. I don't know how yet, but—" Maria interrupted him, her voice trembling slightly. "Stop talking. You're being recorded." The line went dead. That was the moment he knew he was truly alone. That night, he packed his things into a single duffel bag. Files, drives, camera, a few days' worth of clothes. He left the apartment lights on and a note on the kitchen counter. "If I don't come back, find Abigail." He drove toward the outskirts of the city, where the skyline faded into industrial wasteland. Old power stations, abandoned factories, and one particular complex that appeared again and again in the Safe Haven files, the Stallworth facility. Officially closed since 2009. Unofficially, still receiving shipments from Northbridge Logistics. The gate was locked, but the chain was new, gleaming silver against rust. Someone had been here. Recently. Frank slipped through a gap in the fence, flashlight in hand, heart pounding in his chest. Inside, the complex was a graveyard of silence. Broken windows stared like hollow eyes, and the wind carried the faint metallic scent of decay. He found the main building and forced the door open. Inside, everything was frozen in time. Desks, file cabinets, even coffee mugs with names on them. Dust lay thick like snow. He walked deeper, following the trail of cables running along the floor, to a room that still had power. A soft hum. A single computer screen glowing in the dark. On it, a login window. He typed the first thing that came to mind. R. Hale. Access denied. He tried again. Safe Haven admin. The screen flickered and unlocked. The monitor filled with folders, each labeled with a date and a number. Frank clicked one at random. Inside were medical records, psychological assessments, photos of children ages 7 to 15, most marked unidentified. Each file ended with the same line. Transferred, destination, Echo. Frank scrolled through more, dozens, hundreds, all identical. Echo. A name, a code, a ghost. He searched the database for it, and a single encrypted folder appeared. It was titled Echo, Phase 3. Before he could open it, the screen flickered, and a window popped up. Remote access detected. Session terminated. The lights went out. For a few seconds, the only sound was his own breathing. Then,
Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the hall. Frank turned off his flashlight and slipped behind a file cabinet. Two beams of light cut through the darkness. Flashlights. Voices murmured low. The feed went down. Check the terminal. You think someone was inside? No one's supposed to know this place exists. They passed close enough for him to smell the cologne, the leather of their jackets. And then one of them spoke, a voice Frank recognized instantly. If Dorsey's here, shoot on sight. It was Hale.
Frank's hands tightened into fists, his pulse hammered. He waited until the men moved deeper into the building, then slipped out a side door, running low through the dark yard. He didn't stop until he reached his car. He drove for miles, not daring to look back, until he reached an all-night gas station by the highway. There, under the cold fluorescent lights, he spread his papers out on the hood of his car and stared at them. He had evidence, partial, fragile, dangerous. But not enough. Not enough to expose them. Not enough to save anyone. He needed help. Someone who could go public. Someone beyond the system. He thought of Erin. If she was still alive. Frank returned to the old bus station, hoping she'd left some sign. The place was empty, except for a flyer taped to the wall, flapping in the breeze. It was for a missing person. Erin K. Wallace, age 25, missing since last Tuesday. His throat tightened. He stared at the photo, the same eyes, the same fear. She had tried to tell him everything, and now she was gone too. He sank onto a bench, gripping his head. Around him, the city moved, trains clattering in the distance, footsteps echoing in the tunnel, but none of it felt real anymore. He whispered to himself, voice barely audible. They're not hiding bodies, they're hiding data. And for the first time, the full shape of the conspiracy began to form. The children weren't just missing. They were being reclassified, deleted from databases, erased from public records, reassigned under new identities through the safe haven system. Whatever Echo was, it wasn't just a place. It was a process. Digital, organized, systematic. A way to make children disappear, not just from the streets, but from existence itself. Frank's mind raced. He remembered the server's last login location, coordinates buried in the metadata. He pulled out his laptop, traced the code, and found a hidden line of text embedded in the system. Echo Node 7, Lower Ward Complex, Chicago Medical District. That was the next step. The place where the city buried its secrets, under the guise of hospitals and health data. He packed his files and started the car. As the engine roared to life, rain began to fall, heavy, relentless, washing the streets clean. Or trying to. Frank whispered into his recorder one last time. If you're hearing this, it means they found me. But know this. The system isn't broken. It was built this way. And with that, he drove toward the storm. The rain had turned the streets of Chicago into mirrors, reflections of a city that refused to see itself. Frank drove through the storm, wipers slashing furiously, until the skyline melted behind sheets of water. His destination? The Lower Ward Complex, once part of the city's vast medical district, now, officially, an archival facility for digital records. Unofficially, it was Echo. He parked a block away near an alley where a flickering streetlight struggled against the dark. The air smelled of ozone and wet concrete. His pulse was steady now, not from calm, but from resignation. He knew this was the end of the road. Whatever he found inside, it would either vindicate him or bury him.
Inside the complex, everything was sterile. White walls, humming lights, the faint electric buzz of servers running somewhere deep underground. Frank moved through the corridors with the quiet grace of someone who had lived too long in shadows. He found the access door marked E7, authorized personnel only. He used the stolen keycard from the Stallworth facility. The door clicked open. Behind it was a descent, a long spiraling staircase that led into a sublevel, bathed in a pale blue glow. Rows of machines lined the walls, blinking in steady rhythm like mechanical heartbeats. The air was cold, recycled, impersonal. At the center stood a cylindrical pod surrounded by cables and monitors. And on the screen, a familiar name, Abigail Dorsey. Status active. Frank froze. For years, that name had been a wound. Now, it was a heartbeat on a monitor.
He stepped closer, trembling. The screen showed data points, brain scans, neural sequences, timestamps going back more than 10 years. There was no body here, no child, only data, memories, emotions, a consciousness copied and stored. Echo, he whispered. You weren't a place. You were a system. He scrolled through more records, hundreds of children, all tagged as Echo subjects. Their lives digitized, reconstructed, replicated. Safe Haven hadn't been about rescuing children. It had been about preserving them. Or rather, what was left of them. Their minds, their patterns, their emotional imprints. Frank realized with a cold clarity that the missing weren't truly missing. They had been translated. Then came the sound. A door opening behind him. Footsteps. Calm. Familiar. I told you, Frank, some ghosts shouldn't be chased. It was Hale. But his tone wasn't mocking this time. It was tired, almost regretful. You were right, Hale. There was something bigger, but it's not what you think. We didn't kill them. We saved them. From the streets, from poverty, from the lives they were born into. We gave them a second existence. Frank turned slowly. By erasing them? By perfecting them. The words hung in the air, sterile and monstrous. Hale stepped closer, gesturing to the pod. Echo is the future. Data doesn't die, Frank. It evolves. Those children, they'll outlive us all. Frank stared at the glowing monitor. That's not life, he said softly. That's a prison made of numbers. He turned off the screen. The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then, Hale sighed. You'll never make them believe you. Frank looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man not evil, but broken by conviction. Maybe not, Frank said. But the truth doesn't need believers. It just needs air. He slipped the drive from his pocket, a small backup of everything he'd copied. He walked past Hale without another word, climbed the stairs, and stepped into the night. Outside, the rain had stopped.
The first light of dawn broke over the city, pale and uncertain. Frank stood on the street corner, watching as Chicago slowly came alive again. Taxis honking, shopkeepers unlocking doors, life moving on. He pulled out his recorder one last time. His voice was hoarse, but steady. My name is Franklin Dorsey. If you're hearing this, it means Echo has been exposed. Somewhere out there, a child who was supposed to vanish is being remembered. Maybe that's all we can do. Remember. Because in the end, memory is the only thing that makes us real. He turned off the recorder and walked away, blending into the morning crowd. Behind him, the sun rose higher, and for the first time in years, Chicago felt awake. The story you just heard is inspired by true patterns of loss, memory, and the fragile line between salvation and control. In every city, there are things we choose not to see, and people who refuse to stop looking. If this story moved you or made you think about the world just a little differently, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life, stories that ask difficult questions and explore the mysteries that shape our humanity. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, stay brave, and never stop searching for the truth.